Well, hello, and welcome to my place. Regarding your question, what I would love to learn, if I had the chance of being a mosquito following you, is how you would go from being there in a certain place to decide what story you want to tell, how you approach the people, find the moment and get in such a beautiful and artistic way. Okay, I think I know what you mean. Well, there's two ways to travel, and I'm not necessarily afforded both ways anymore. In the old days, I could take off for a year, 2 years. I've done plenty of trips. My first ever real big trip was over 2 years, where I didn't come home for 2 years. I went to many different countries in that process, but I was traveling the whole time. And if that's the way you travel, then your method of deciding what story you want to tell is different from the way I work now. Now I have a family, I've got 3 kids, and I can't take those long trips because they need their dad, basically. I have to think about what trip I want to do and then go out and do it. So one involves a lot more research than the other. I secretly, deep down, I prefer the first way, the kind of take off for 2 years and go off and find stories. And the way you do that is up to you. I mean, these days, I always try and hook up with what we call a fixer, which is basically a guide who understands media workers. I try and hook up with someone also mainly acts as a translator. That person, you will employ them to be by your side the whole time on a trip. They therefore act as an interpreter, but as a sourcer of the answers to almost any problem you have. And all around the world, in most countries, there are great fixers. And the way you find a fixer is not easy if you're starting out, but word of mouth is by far the best way to find a fixer. If you can't find a fixer by word of mouth, a sneaky technique that I've used once or twice in my career, if I'm going to a country where no one knows anyone who to work with, I find the best film I can find about that place. Say I want to go to Afghanistan, or not Afghanistan, let's say, a part of China, Yunnan province, and I need a fixer there and I don't know anyone, I will find the best film I can find on Yunnan province. It might be something like BBC's Wild China, for example. Run to the credits, look down at the very last credit, and often, almost 100% of the time, at the end of the credits it says, "Special thanks to." And if you Google every single name there, you'll soon realise one of those names owns a travel company. And if they do, the chances are that's who the production team used as their fixer. So there's a little tip if you don't have any friends who you can ask. There's one way to find your story, is you hook up with a fixer on the ground in the country you want to go to, who can tell you about stories. Easier than that, of course, is a quick Google search on the place you want to go. And the best way to get the best stories out of a Google search is to learn to read between the lines of a Google search. Often, I will start with an image search on Google for the place I'm going to. Let's use the Yunnan province again. And just see what comes up, which is wow. And that will give me a good idea that I may want to punctuate my trip with at least one visit to one of the best pictures I can find on Google of that particular place. However, the best stories are the untold stories. And the way to find them is, like I say, to read between the lines. What's great about countries where the written text is different from Romance languages like English, French, European languages. A lot of stories that get written down online, like in Cyrillic or using Chinese characters or whatever, they often don't make it into the Western press because people searching for stories in the West overlook the stories because they're not written in English. And in particular, I find stories in Cyrillic. You know, I've been to a few places like Bulgaria and, you know, Russia. And if you look just in a local newspaper in Bulgaria, you'll see, or what gets shared amongst Bulgarians on Facebook, which is written in Cyrillic. There are some exceptionally funny and interesting and unusual stories which are getting reported in the press in Bulgaria, but not really making it into the press in the West because, or I say the West, the press in, you know, English-speaking countries, because no one's reporting it in English. And that's happened to me a few times, especially in Bulgaria. I mean, one of my favourite stories was a story I shot about a place called Buzludja, which is this derelict sort of socialist, former headquarters of the Socialist Party in Bulgaria that was abandoned in the late 80s. And I only heard about that because I was in Bulgaria working at a film festival. I was speaking at a film festival in Bulgaria. And one of the other speakers was Alexander Ivanov, who's a Bulgarian photographer. And he'd done kind of Bulgaria from the air using a Microlight before drones and all that kind of stuff. And he'd created some great books and he gave them to me as a present. And on the front page of one of his books was this amazing picture of the inside of Buzludja. And I said to him, where the hell is this? I've never seen anything like it before. It was, you know, it was amazing. And he told me, oh, it's, you know, he showed me where it was. And he said, well, look, I'll show you around if you want. So there was my story. That's where the story came from. It came from a word of mouth with a guy. However, I then took that story and made it my own, and that's really important. His picture was amazing. It really was amazing. But reading between the lines of his photos, this building was at the top of a mountain, and I know from experience Bulgaria gets very cold and snowy in the winter. I Google searched it to start with, and there was nothing about it on Google in English. And then I said to Alexander, has anyone shot this in the winter with snow? And he's like, I don't know. And we couldn't find anything online. So that was in the summer when I met him, and I arranged to come back in January and shoot a few stories in Bulgaria, all things I'd discovered while I was there on the ground at this photo festival. And going to Buzludja in the winter was one of them. And it turned into an excellent little story, because it was hard to get to in the snow and it was completely cut off, and it was like snow up to our waist trying to wade up to this thing. And then when we got there, it was just fantastic. And that was good for me because when you see someone else who's shot a story well, it's up to you to improve upon that, or in my opinion, leave it alone. You know, copying other people's stories is fine if you want to do that, but it'll never set you apart from anyone else. And take it from me, I look at a lot of portfolios because I'm involved in, you know, so many things where I kind of have to judge what other people are. Right. Rookie lesson number 1. Battery died on me. Mid-sentence. No idea what I was talking about then. We were talking about Bulgaria, weren't we? Yes, I'll go back, sorry. If you discover a story that someone else has shot, great. But like I say, you owe it to yourself to work out a way to shoot it differently, to make it better, to do it differently somehow. Because I know this from first-hand experience, because people, well, take Buzludja, for example. You know, that once that story broke, I put it on my website, and it's hilarious. I had a very funny weekend on my website. The page was downloaded almost 500,000 times over the weekend. And my server that I'm on wrote me a very frantic set of emails saying, we believe that your website is under attack and all this kind of stuff. But it was basically because, for example, it hit the front, the story I put on my website hit the front page of Reddit twice. It went one day, and then the next day, someone else posted it and went to the front page again. It was one of those stories which the internet loved. It was about something cool and quirky that no one knew about, that was shot well, and there was a good story to go along with it. Like I say, Alexander Ivanov shot it first, as far as I can tell. He was the one that brought it to my attention. So in order to honour that, I made sure I did it completely differently to him. And the way I did that was by going in the middle of winter and making it a story about getting there as well, because no one had shot aerials of it. This was just before drones were kind of, you know, ubiquitous like they are now. And I knew I had to get an aerial because there was nothing, even in the Bulgarian websites, there was nothing from the air. And it's this amazing, you know, structure that needed to be seen from the air. Now, back then, before drones, you had to fly over it. There's no other way of doing it. And the best we could do was Alexander knew a guy who owned a Microlight, and I paid him a bit of money and he said, yeah, I'll fly you over. And it was horrendous. I mean, it was the middle of winter, so it was cold anyway, let alone being up in the sky at speed. And we had terrible weather, and the story ended well because there was so much tension. I was there for 5 days, and every day the Microlight guy said, no, we can't fly. It's too cloudy. You never fly through clouds when you're in a Microlight and all this stuff. And he had, at the end of that week, I had 5 days to shoot this. At the end of the week, he had to go to the completely other side of Bulgaria because he did agricultural surveys in his Microlight and things like this, I think, or geological surveys. So we had this time scale where we had to get this shoot, otherwise it was never going to happen. And it was literally on the last morning when I said to him, look, I really, really want to go. And it was very, what's the word? It was irresponsible of me, really. But, you know, we do a lot of irresponsible things in our life, and life's often more exciting and better for them. And this was one of those cases because I managed to convince this guy on the last morning to fly just up under the clouds, bearing in mind it was even snowing while we were flying. It was incredibly dangerous. And we flew up, we took off from a road. We used a road as a runway to wait until there was no cars coming, and then zoomed down this road, took off, flew up, and literally circled this thing twice and came back down. And it was the scariest 15 minutes of my life. I had to take my shooting hand glove off in order to actually get my finger on the button because it was so, you know, my gloves were so big. And it went numb within 10 seconds, it went completely numb. And for the whole trip, I didn't know without looking whether I was even pressing the shutter because I couldn't feel anything. And it's very hard sitting behind, you know, imagine the Microlight guy's sitting here and you're sitting here and you're trying to, you know, get shots over here, and you can't scream in his ear and say, go left or right, because he hasn't got any idea. So you basically have to do what he does. But yeah, it paid off. I got the whole story from start to finish, which was us getting there, pictures of inside of this place, and then the money shot, which was this kind of aerial shot. And so that's kind of a good example of how I come across, how I end up with a story and get my version of it to Tatiana. That's how I decided what story I wanted to tell. It started because I saw an opportunity to shoot something differently to someone else. And that's one way of finding a story. The best way to find a story is to find a story on the ground, especially in the 80s and 90s when I used to travel around Southeast Asia and India and places like that. There were so many untold stories, you could literally sniff them out with yourself. You know, there's so much media out there, there's so many pictures out there. It's very easy to look at a set of pictures and read between the lines, like as you would in a kind of a news report or a journalist's report on a place. You can read between the lines of photos as well and go, you know, I think they're missing a trick here, or they're not concentrating on this aspect, or someone goes to a lovely, beautiful, scenic place and shoots amazing pictures, and then you do a bit of delving around and you realise there's a community of people living there. So now you've got a better story. You've got a community of people that hopefully are quite interesting, but set amidst the backdrop of an incredible scene. So for me, that improves the story and you find a new aspect of it yourself. So at that point, it says, how do you approach the people? Find the moment and get it in such a beautiful and artistic way. Well, that's personal preference, and that's to do with your personality and to do with all kinds of aspects of yourself. How I approach the people, the easiest way is with a fixer. The hardest way is on your own, especially if you don't speak the language. So I would always advocate bringing a translator with you if you can afford it. And the cheapest way to find a translator is to get an English teacher. And interestingly, many of the best fixers in the world now, in their respective countries, originally were school teachers, because back in the day, in the 90s, you know, when we were traveling to places where, you know, where tourism wasn't occurring, you were always approached first by the person that spoke English or whatever your language was. And so as a result, over time, these people have worked more and more with foreigners, and they've ended up being fixers. But, you know, that's my advice, is always to have a translator with you, because it just opens so many doors. And there's nothing worse than people feeling uncomfortable when you're hanging around with them. And one of the ways that people feel most uncomfortable is if you don't understand them. So bringing a translator along just increases your experience and your photographic hit rate exponentially. It's well worth the money. And like I say, find a way. It's like even employing someone who doesn't speak that good at English, you're still doing a good thing for the community. You're pumping a little bit of money into the community, and someone's getting something out of it, and you're getting good photos and good access out of it. So that's one of the most easiest way to approach people. When I'm approaching people on my own, I've said this many times before, I don't walk into a situation with my camera out, and I certainly don't walk in and start shooting straight away. That goes without saying. How you deal with people is about your own personality, and you know, that's different for everyone. And I don't think that's something you should try and learn from somebody else. I think being you know, what the most important thing in any situation, if you're, you know, in a photographic situation with people, is that the people you're with feel comfortable. Certainly from my perspective anyway, that's how I want to work with people. I want them to feel comfortable. And there are many tricks for making people feel comfortable, but the best one is just giving of yourself to them, and giving someone the time. You know, we're all humans. We all respond to the same things in life. And, you know, a smile and you know, like a giving attitude will always open doors for you. And like I say, just put yourself in their shoes. You imagine someone, if you're in India shooting, imagine an Indian tourist knocking on your door and coming into your kitchen and saying, I really want to shoot a photo of you cooking your dinner, which is often, you know, what ends up happening in places. How do you feel? And if you feel a little bit weird about it, that's how they feel. So learn how to deal with it that way. Learn how to make someone feel cool about you being in their kitchen when you're shooting. And everyone's going to be different. So that's a hard question to answer. As I've got older, especially, I take far less photos. And a great lesson in photography is learning which photos not to take, because the less photos you take, the less annoying you are to people. And that can really destroy a relationship, too much clicking, or too much poking of your camera into people's lives. So you have to strike a balance, and everyone's different. And last part of that question is, how do you get the moment in such beautiful and artistic ways? Well, that really is the subject for a completely different video, and I could never sum that up in one sentence. If you looked at my portfolio from 20 years ago, it was pretty crap, as we say. It was pretty normal and not that good, which just showed me that, you can learn to be a good photographer. Everyone can. It's not even highly important to have what they call a good eye, because I've often wondered whether that's a real thing. What I do know is if you want to be a good photographer, is you need to be very driven to take good photos. You need to be able to understand what a good photo is. So if you look at someone else's picture and go, wow, I love that picture, and you can decipher why that is, then you can shoot it yourself, I promise you. You can shoot a good photo yourself, but the best shooters are the people that have practiced the most. And by practicing, I mean going out and practicing your craft, doing it. You know, and 20 years ago, I was driven, but I wasn't very good. 20 years later, I'm a much better photographer. I'm not as driven, you know, and that's fine by me. But you have to work constantly. Bearing in mind, I was a journalist for almost 7 years, shooting 2 or 3 stories a day, 7 days a week for 6 years. Imagine how many photos I shot, and imagine how much of a learning curve that was. You need that learning curve. Otherwise, your hit rate on good photos is not going to be as good as the guy or girl that's done more, put more hours in. It's as simple as that. So there you go, Tatiana. I thought I'd actually answer more questions than this, but let's start with that. I'll put this out there, and I hope that was informative for you. And like I say, the best thing to do would be to write in the comment below this video what kind of another question you'd like. Just go ahead and ask me in what direction I should go in, and have a good week. Nice to see you all. Bye.